We are in the chapter titled Oneness, and as would be expected, the entire theme of the chapter is oneness. Not about oneness, but the experience of oneness itself. In this, he has first laid a summary of the path of the yoga of integral knowledge, withdrawing from the false identification with mind, life force and body. One finds first the base of freedom in the silence of the Brahman, a complete, absolute stillness and freedom. From there, one turns back in the second movement to re-embrace the world from the poise of freedom, engaging fully in the world. And it is at this point that the second movement is complete, when the self-knowledge, the awareness we have is integral. You're fully engaged and free at the same time. This poise, he says, is the poise of the Satchidananda in the way the divine knows himself and his cosmos. He takes up then an approach which makes us view the experience of the world very differently. He points out that most of the traditional systems, while they accept this principle that the oneness is everywhere, in all things, in all states, in all experiences, they say, but it is more in certain states than in others. So, the oneness is more absolute in the unformed, in the impersonal, or in the silence, than in the multiplicity, in the personal or in form. It's still oneness, but it's more there, less here. And the moment you make that separation, then all these other terms become lesser, the other becomes higher, and then you end up with an exclusive, one-sided focus. Sri Aurobindo points out that we find oneness in all things, but equally. It's a different kind of, he says, a different kind of absoluteness of vision. You don't aim for the one absolute experience against others and call that absolute. Instead, you aim at a single vision of oneness in all things, as much in the absolute as in the relative. This shift is very important, because as long as we have the stain of that bias, we will find always in our life some kind of compromise. The bias that the oneness is more in certain states and less in other states. If oneness is more in silence of meditation but less in action in life, well, you will have a bias. You will tend to withdraw. You will tend to exaggerate one side against the other. This correction that Sri Aurobindo brings is extremely important. And so we'll dwell on it a little more to see its full ramifications. He says, the integral knowledge does not make any division. It must be the same oneness everywhere, in everything, in all states, in all poises of consciousness, in all aspects of the self, and the same oneness. And he says, in that way, it arrives at a different kind of absoluteness in its vision of the unity. Here in this paragraph which we have read last time, the focus is on this vision of the unity. In the next paragraph which we will take up today, he turns that vision into an active realization all the way into life. But first, this vision is our foundation. If I had to take an analogy, let's say we look at a child has built a sand castle, and the child has created, let's say, a tower, and then a few buildings in the sand castle, a few human figures, maybe a hole for a dungeon, and he has created a perimeter. If you were to approach this as an analogy for the world, there are so many approaches one could take. One could say, you do not know the height of the world unless you climb all the way to the tower. And it would be true. You do not know the depth of the world unless you go all the way into the dungeon. And yes, it could be another exaggeration. Someone else would say, you do not know the world integrally unless you know the full perimeter that defines it. And yes, that also would be true. But if you go deeper into the question, you would say, all of these are special poises, special statuses of the sand. Here sand is piled high, there sand is dug low, here sand is surrounding. But it is the sand which is the substratum, the very substance of it. And if you truly want to know this world, you must know its underlying substance, the sand itself which makes it. And when you know sand, when you live by its reality, whether at the top of the tower or at the base of the dungeon, it is the same sand. If you go a little deeper into the whole question, breaking out of this analogy, in the case of the divine, the creation is one with the Creator. The creation is an expression of the Creator. There's no separation. There's no child sitting outside making the sand castle. He becomes sand castle. In that case, to know the height, the depth, the width, the perimeter and everything, they are all aspects of the one being, one person. To know Him in all things is the true absoluteness, isn't it, of the oneness. And so it is to this that Sri Aurobindo brings us, not the height, not the depth, not the width, but the underlying substratum of oneness, of His being. And His being has, so to say, three aspects. There is the Sat, the being Himself, He exists. And because He exists, the whole world is. Second aspect is, this existence is His utter awareness. And therefore the whole world underlying is supported by this secret consciousness, not always revealed, mostly concealed, but it is conscious. The universe is conscious. The universe is His being. And third, His awareness is a delight. The delight to be aware. The very existence is His delight and His awareness. And so, underlying everything in the world is the delight that supports all creation. The mother observes that if this delight was not supporting, nothing could have survived. In fact, we can even say the extremes of struggle, pain, distress, or pleasure are all possible as waves of the play because of this one underlying delight that supports equally everything. So if we were to truly know the world and truly know the divine in the world, where would you put your focus? In the play of the pain, pleasure, or in the underlying delight which makes possible this play and which exists in the play and which is the very foundation of this existence? And so it is to this that Sri Aurobindo points, a different kind of absoluteness, he says, in its vision of the unity. The experience of the absolute and the experience of the relative are like the peak of the tower and the play of the forms. You can know one against the other, but to know that which makes all this is the true absoluteness in our vision. And that one being is what we are focusing on. We saw how in various aspects the same oneness is not only existent but can be experienced equally. And yet within this oneness there are two broad divisions, the sense of unity and the sense of separation or difference. They are both broad aspects which then move into other aspects, many other facets of the experience. And to this, Sri Aurobindo observes, all unity is to this one experience of oneness. All unity is to it an intense, pure and infinite realization. All difference an abundant, rich and boundless realization of the same divine and eternal being. Many yogis, especially if they are living in the forests or in some isolation, it doesn't matter because they are not being tested. They may think that they have it, but it doesn't work. When actually they are tested, when actually something happens that challenges, their normal nature goes back to its old habits. The yogi who is full of detachment and equality and in a universal joy, in his cave, when he steps out, the smell of cooking may suddenly create a whole strong reaction of greed and desire. And he may say, it's just in my body. I am not body. But then the perfection is not complete. As far as Sri Aurobindo is concerned, you may have this totality of consciousness in a universality, but it must then extend all the way into your individuality. So this third step is really describing this. To live, think, feel, will and act in that sense of unity is its effectuation in the individual being and the individual life. And it's necessary to state this because the earlier two phases did not feel yourself to be individual. You were in a more large consciousness and experience. Now you must ensure the perfection all the way into this tiny surface, little individuality that from that poise seems almost trivial. The sequence he uses the words live, think, feel, will and act. The sequence is very important. As a first step, live captures an overall sense. The experience now begins to fill the individual mind, life, body in a general way. Whatever I do, something of this unity is acting or is present. It's never separate from me or I am not separate from it. So it's a broad frame of living in the unity or with the unity. But then comes what emerges from you as you live in it. And the first thing which emerges from you is a thought. Any action you do, first there is a basis of thought. And if in the thought, the thinking habit is not based in the unity, you may still think in terms of separatenesses, purely by habit. And so the thought itself has to be recast to act from this poise of unity. Feeling similarly, which is a more instinctive, less under your control. The emotional feel might still have the sense of separateness. The thought is easier to bring in alignment, the emotions more difficult because more instinctive, less conscious. So in the sequence you will see from think to feel. And then there is the further degree of an impulse of action. You may say, I am thinking and from my thought I will act. Yes, that's a will which is conscious, But rarely in your life do you do such things. Most of your willing is impulsive and instinctive. Observe carefully, since morning, all through the day, how many times did you actually pause to think, I want to do this, and then do it? Probably never. Almost every willing took place, the willing took place often by habit. You're just used to doing it that way. Or when in an unusual situation, the will came forward and did it according to your character, your nature. And you're quite happy, you don't even bother. You're not conscious of when the will originated or when it moved until it has already begun to do its thing. And because it's pretty much set in the pattern that I'm used to calling me and my character, I don't think about it. Unless it deviated too much, then I would say, oh, what's this? What happened? What did I do? And you would put some restraint. But we're not conscious. So this is actually the impulse of will in us is one of the least conscious, although we can make it conscious if we chose to take it as a discipline. So to live, which is a general description, think, which you can do more consciously, feel, which you can do with a little more effort, and then will. And to bring all workings of your will under the overall imprint of this sense of unity. To have the will itself emerge from the sense of unity and act in alignment with the unity would lead eventually to the action which follows the will, which is also an expression of the unity. Now you'll see in the way he formulates it, the form of the action is not specified. The action could be a form of speech, the action could be a form of energy thrown out non-physically, or a thought idea thrown out, or it could be a physical movement of action, doesn't matter. All are action. If a yogi sitting in his cave puts out a strong will of the mind into an action on a situation, it's as much an action as if he gets up with his body and makes that action with his hands. When the president or prime minister of a country signs on a piece of paper which becomes now law, the physical action is nominal, signature on a paper. The real action is massive on the whole of the country. Suddenly everybody now is compelled to follow whatever that law is now imposed. A whole machinery moves. So the physical action is perhaps the most trivial. The thought intention and will intention behind the action is far more powerful, and the nature of the actual action is non-tangible here. But it's so much greater. In practice, the less tangible, the more powerful is the nature of the action. The more tangible, the more it is reduced in its scope and in its range and effect. This is the deeper truth of things, isn't it? So he does not specify what action. It includes all these actions. So to live, think, feel, will and act in that sense of unity is its effectuation, is the effectuation of this knowledge of unity in the individual being and in the individual life. So let's reread this, because it's one sentence with three separate phrases. To know Satchidananda, one in himself and one in all his manifestation, is the basis of knowledge. To make that vision of oneness real to the consciousness in its status and in its action, and to become that by merging the sense of separate individuality in the sense of unity with the being and with all beings, is its effectuation in the yoga of knowledge. To live, think, feel, will and act in that sense of unity is its effectuation in the individual being and the individual life. Now you can see in this one sentence, the full program is mapped out. It's not enough that you experience this unity and live in it in a special status. It must be extended all the way. And nothing left which is not sharing in, identified with, or basing itself entirely upon this unity. Everything must live in it and flow from it. Then he concludes with a sentence which is extraordinary. This realization of oneness and this practice of oneness in difference is the whole of the yoga. So two things, realization of the oneness, and second, practice of oneness in difference is the whole of the yoga. In a sense, it shows you two facets of the yoga, and unless the two are together, you do not have the whole of the yoga. It could be so easy to take one of these two facets and say, this is the yoga. In the first case, you could take the practice of, you could take the realization of oneness, and then you could be in your cave and say, this is it, I have completed the yoga. On the other side, you have the practice of oneness in difference, and you could even take that exclusively. People do tend to do that with very little success in the long term, but you do tend to try to put into practice first in the form before there is a deeper realization. And it is extremely useful. Most of modern social development is based on this attempt to practice oneness in difference. All of our laws, all of our political systems, all of our social structures, even our fashions, even our technologies, all are really an attempt to put into practice oneness in difference. You see how it works? What we call democracy. What are you trying to do in it? You're trying somehow to include everybody in the decision making. Meaning the oneness which is the truth behind the appearances of our differences. We're trying to bring that forward a little more. It was the autocracy where somebody sat down and imposed it on the group. It was also an attempt to bring oneness, but as a form it brought out less of the oneness. I imposing my will on an entire clan or country or world is also an attempt to bring everything into oneness, isn't it? In a perverse way or in a limited way. When I recognize that the oneness is as much in all and try to evoke the oneness in others, I am still exercising an autocratic imposition, imposing your freedom or compelling you to recognize your freedom. You see, the transition from autocracy to democracy is almost that. You're forcing people to recognize, look, you have a right to vote, you have to exercise your will. And people say, yeah, but I'm happy with what you're choosing. Why are you imposing it on me? Right? And yet when that awakening takes place in the collective and people say, yes, I am participating, I am as much a part of this decision making, it's a greater emergence of oneness. Between these two extremes, of course, you can have many variations and systems. Beyond these, democracy as we have it organized today is a very weak, but a first step of the organized expression of oneness. It can only go so far. It fails not because of the systems not being implemented. You could implement democracy perfectly, but it fails because the individuals who are participating, who are supposed to be expressing the deeper truth of the oneness in difference, are not sufficiently conscious of the true nature of the oneness. The failure is psychological, not in the system or structure. And that's why the systems can only take you so far, and then you say, well, the system stops here. But when people start waking up, let's say, start with a smaller group. Let's do it in a family. We have a democracy in a family of 10. Okay? And so we had perhaps a voting pattern initially and the majority chose. But as we grow and awaken, we realize, but we are one family. And in that underlying sense of oneness of my family, when somebody, the child says, but I want my chocolate, and we don't have enough money, and you think I should save the money for something which is much more important, but the child says, I want my chocolate, what do you do as a mother? Well, you say, all right, we will sacrifice our superior understanding of your great future for the present. And you give in. And it is a minority, and the majority gives in to the minority. Why? Because it experiences a deeper sense of oneness in which majority and minority are concepts which are artificial and fake. This is a real story. Tara Johar narrates how she went to the mother and said, we want to go for a picnic. And that meant a lot of expense. They had to prepare for the food, they had to prepare vehicles, there's a whole elaborate system and expense. And mother said, I don't have enough money. I have to run this ashram and there's not enough money right now. We're in a severe financial crunch. And Tara began to cry. She's a little kid. She starts crying, but mother, we want to go for our picnic. And after a while, mother says, okay, you have your picnic. And she gave the funds. You can see in the balance, there's the whole institution of the ashram to run where there's huge crash crunch. Somewhere something major will have to be chopped off for this picnic. And what's the value of the picnic in terms of the ashram's existence? Almost trivial. But for the mother, that human part, then what it implied, what was being done through it, in the balance, she made that choice. And a collective in a family, now let's extend from your 10 people of family to 1,000 people, to the whole of Auroville, to the whole of a country. When we feel ourselves deeply connected as a family, you do not need to vote. You can have a discussion, and a pretty free, clear discussion, and very quickly you come to an understanding and move forward. But it's a level of democracy which right now is unimaginable. It will be founded on a shift in consciousness. Whether you will call it democracy or not, it doesn't matter. The vocabulary is not important. But what we're describing here is a series of steps in the collective expression in which oneness is coming more and more to the fore in the play of difference. And systems and structures are only assisting, and to the extent that they can assist you to move from here to there, they are useful. When they prevent you from moving further, the system has become defunct. You discard it or modify it, replace it by something else. But the process is really this: practice of oneness in difference, but without realizing the deeper oneness. And so it can only go so far. So you see, these two aspects are so complementary. The realization of oneness, that's when you experience this. And on the other side, the practice of oneness in difference. The two together is the whole of the yoga. But because we took only that other side, I said political, economic, social, and all these conventions really are intended to assist the emergence of the oneness. To the extent that they assist, we will call it a civilization. To the extent that they suppress the emergence of oneness and difference, we will call it barbaric, uncivilized. You see? We could take up more examples going into it, but I think you get the idea. In our economic structures, similarly, the current framework of what we call socialism, or on the other side, the capitalism, both are attempting in a different way to bring forward this sense of oneness. Socialism starts by imposing in the form, ensure equal distribution. And it works, again, up to a point. It fails because individuals use the equal distribution to subvert something else. The freedom, for example, or something else. or they use it to impose their individual will, because somebody controls the distribution process. They impose their individual will, suppress the freedom. On the other side, you have the attempt to create by tapping into the greed and desire of individuals, activating the greed and desire, and somehow making a more energetic flow which may increase resources much more. And again, it works up to a point until you discover that the very process subverts itself eventually, when eventually there's an alignment of interests which becomes a monopoly secretly, and you have to break and restart and break and restart and so on. Both things take you so far, but destroy other aspects of the social fabric. Both fail, and the only thing which can ensure their unity, Sri Aurobindo observes, in one case, he says, the principle of equality is exaggerated at the loss of freedom. On the other side, freedom is exaggerated with the loss of equality. But the two cannot coexist unless there is the third principle of fraternity. And what is fraternity? Precisely this: oneness underlying the differences. The thing which binds and unites us, when that comes forward first, then equality and liberty can coexist. He makes this observation in the three words which were used in the French Revolution. If the sequence had been changed, if first fraternity had been placed, and the work on building fraternity had been ensured, the other two would have merged easily. But in the absence of fraternity, these two will split. The crisis today in the world is really reminding us of that. And the solution is really to correct for this. Bring forward the aspect of fraternity. The rest will work itself out. Systems will grow, change. That's not so important. So this whole effort is the human struggle to grow and organize itself and evolve. But without the deeper foundation which already knows the unity. So necessarily the process is very slow. Over many centuries, a little small step. And the systems, we are busy protecting systems when we forget what we need to do is boost this underlying experience, realization of oneness. A lot of it could be done through education, where early on you have access to young minds and hearts. If you bring these principles into their lives, very quickly you'll have a society which will live by those values much more deeply. In other words, you introduce this deeper knowledge of yoga or its practice early on, and so much more could be changed or speeded up in human evolution. In other words, you have yoga as representing the realization of oneness, and then its extension, its influence in the current structures and systems which are attempting to put into practice oneness and difference, but without knowing the oneness. When these two join, you have something which is a rapidly effective evolutionary base. The 5 dreams that Sri Aurobindo spoke of in 1947, of these, the first was the rise of Asia and then the freedom of India. And it was on that occasion that he spoke of the 5 dreams. But then the other 3 involved the larger awakening of unity in the world and this spiritual knowledge coming forward. The larger unity, its first signs are present in the framework itself of the internet and its result in us of being able to sense and to know things all around the world as if they are part of our daily life here. But with that, the emergence of the knowledge of spirituality, the yoga itself, is only first beginning. The yoga that is probably still the popular form is much more physical than the spiritual or psycho-spiritual knowledge, but that's creeping in. And that would lead eventually to the 5th dream, which is the new step in evolution. The emergence of this knowledge of yoga in the collective consciousness is the indicator. The moment you see that happening in a firm way, you know that the fifth step will also become active much more rapidly. But I digressed from the text because of its implications for the larger human evolution. But now coming back to our individual consciousness and the smaller collectivity and community, which is our spiritual family, the realization of oneness and this practice of oneness and difference is the whole of the yoga. You cannot have practice of oneness and difference if there is not community. Which is why in the integral yoga, the transformation of life being an essential component, it has to base itself in a collective effort eventually. Even if the collectivity is not participating in your personal effort, well, you still have to engage with the collectivity, engage with life and with humanity. It's for this reason that although initially the ashram had very strict isolation from the world, the isolation was not exclusive. There was always an exchange, but an exchange which was moderated and controlled to ensure that the things which are helpful come in, and from the ashram itself a helpful influences goes out. But a moderated exchange was kept. If you suddenly remove those barriers without some kind of a vigilance, then of course the poisonous influences come in, and then what is going out can easily get dispersed and lose the purity or character, quality and depth that it has. Both of these dangers we are actually facing right now, and for the last 20 years perhaps. It began primarily through the invasion of television. In the ashram, the mother had put a boundary of influences coming in this form. Of course, books, one could see what was coming in, but cinema went through a kind of an internal process of selection and even some editing before it was shown in the community for the children and whoever else was interested. But with television, in every house you had things, and if you see the last 20 years, the values and standards in the public have dropped so much. There's so much of coarseness and crudeness and influences which contradict the psychic sensitivity. These things are soaked in by the children, and then we see this popping up now in the community life in ways which are extremely harmful spiritually. But there are two solutions. One is to bring back some kind of a barrier, which is very difficult to do. I would even say almost impossible now that one has come to this stage. Everybody would rebel saying you're taking away our freedom. So I don't think that can be done. But what can be done, which is the second option, is to have a collective discussion. What is important for us in the community life? What do we need to encourage? What do we need to filter out? How do we bring that practically? And find some kind of a via media that there is a collective effort to maintain those values which nourish the psychic presence and which do not to allow the values which contradict our evolutionary purpose. And some kind of practical arrangement is possible in the collective goodwill. But this has to be done. It won't happen by itself. So the oneness in difference is what I was dwelling on. You need collectivity, you need community. Even if you're living alone in a city, practicing the integral yoga there. You would have to participate in some way in the city life according to your temperament and interests and capacities. Doesn't matter what. But some kind of engagement with humanity would be necessary if this process is to be taken to its fullness and completion. I will draw on the example of Ramana Maharshi. He notes that it took him 3 days to attain self-realization. But then it took him 10 years to establish the poise of the self in all activities of life. Now you see what that means. And here we're not even speaking of the integral knowledge. self-realization as silence of the self, and that's it. 3 days for this, 10 years for that. Which meant in everything, in every thought, in every feeling, in every action, in the midst of all activities of life, but for which he had to engage with all activities of life. And it meant once he was brought down from the cave in the hill, when he was now living in the collective, he had to do something. So what would he do? He would cook in the kitchen. So he would spend time every day cutting vegetables, preparing the food, even serving until it was no more possible. But he did what he could, whatever was relevant in that context. But into that, to bring this poise of the self entirely, it means minute work, extending it into the tiniest detail. So, this realization of oneness and this practice of oneness indifference is the whole of the yoga. So, when we speak of practice of oneness indifference, you're still living in a consciousness where you see the oneness, but you recognize this play which is possible in the waves, and into the play, that oneness now has to be fully revealed, manifested. How does one do this? What's the basis on which this effort can be made, and how is it to progress? This becomes the rest of the discussion. We will take up a little bit of it for today. Satchidananda is one in himself, in whatever status or whatever plane of existence. We have therefore to make that the basis of all effectuation, whether of consciousness or force or being, whether of knowledge or will or delight. We have, as we have seen, to live in the consciousness of the absolute transcendent and of the absolute manifested in all relations, impersonal and manifest as all personalities, beyond all qualities and rich in infinite quality. A silence out of which the eternal word creates, a divine calm and peace possessing itself in infinite joy and activity. We have to find Him knowing all, sanctioning all, governing all, containing, upholding and informing all as the Purusha, and at the same time executing all knowledge, will and formation as Prakriti, and so on. So you see how he brings now this into rich detail in the practice, where this double poise that was discussed earlier, all the dualities which we discussed last time, and the oneness in them, have to be now expressed in the practice itself. And so this is a fascinating paragraph with a lot of implications in our daily practice, and we will have to take it up in detail next Friday. For now we can pause here and take up any comments or questions. So we can continue this next Friday. This realization of oneness and this practice of oneness indifference is the whole of the yoga. And this one sentence captures such a huge sweep, you can see, including this whole thing which we discussed, which is part of the unconscious yoga of nature in human development, all our efforts to bring forward this underlying unity, which now is enormously accelerated when we bring the conscious yoga into the world. It's an extraordinary sentence. It's worth dwelling upon again and again, and the full implication of it is so rich.